Hello, and welcome to Assumption's first Lenten Evening of Faith. My name is Shane Tytenicz, and I'm a licensed clinical counselor here in Chicago, and I've also served as Assumption's pastoral counselor for the last 3 years. Tonight's talk is entitled Exiting the Tomb, Preparing for Life After COVID. It's hard to believe. It's about 1 year ago right now that the world basically shut down in a way we've never seen before. Last year, I was not the first Assumption speaker in the series, but unintentionally, I was the last. It had not gotten through the full series when things had shut down, and yet after I spoke, everything kind of stopped, and I'm really shocked that I was asked to be back as a result of that. But here we are, a year later. Whenever this happened, Psychology Today, which is a service that puts out, it's like a directory for therapists. So if you want to find a therapist, you go to the Psychology Today directory. That's all over the city. So whenever that happened, Psychology Today sent out an email to say, hey, we're going to put a little box, like 2 sentences, give you space to say how you're going to address your practice during COVID. So a lot of people said, I am practicing telehealth. I'm still open to see people, but it's all through telehealth. It was something like that. And I decided that I was going to take a little different approach. And so here's what I put on my little 2-sentence blurb. I said, COVID-19 has disrupted your life. The question is, how can this be a transformative experience for you? Let's explore this together. And that's basically the focus of tonight's talk, is for us to look at what has transformed in your life, what is still transforming in your life, as we're not completely out of the woods yet, and what sort of transformations are you looking forward to once this pandemic is more fully behind us. So some people would say, well, Shane, this is a pandemic. How were you thinking in terms of this being a transformative experience from the very beginning? And quite frankly, that goes to my faith and my experience of living into and out of the Paschal mystery. So if you've heard my talks before, I'm usually talking about the Paschal mystery, and tonight's going to be no different. And so for those of you who need a refresher, we're going to put up a little diagram. And I'm going to just kind of talk you through just as a fresher so that you know what I'm talking about when I say the Paschal mystery. So if you'll notice up in the upper right, this is when we talk about the Paschal mystery, these are points in Jesus's life that in a sense he modeled for us. And he modeled it not just as a one-time event for himself, but he left it as a model that we are invited to become partakers within this Paschal mystery. So I'm going to talk you through the cycle, starting with up in the upper right hand. Not a fun place to start, but pain and suffering. And of course, during the Easter season, we focus on that 2 weeks prior to Jesus' death on the cross. We refer to the passion of Christ, where it was, visceral, bloody, tortuous, basically, experience for Christ, that sort of pain and suffering. But of course, for us, most of us aren't going through that sort of pain and suffering, but it's more of a psychological, emotional, spiritual pain and suffering. But he incurred that pain and suffering, which culminated then around the cycle to his death on the cross. Then we go down to the bottom of the diagram where he was placed in the tomb for 3 days. And we commemorate that sort of liminal space where his death had occurred and the disciples were actually stunned. We know what's coming, but they didn't have that benefit at the time. And so they didn't really know that resurrection was coming. However, Christ promised that. And 3 days, Christ arose from the tomb. And so there's this resurrection. Life sprang from this experience of death. And yet there had to be this time of transformation between the death on the cross and the resurrection. And so that's kind of a liminal space like we've been living in for about a year now. So then 3 days later, resurrection, and then ascension into new life. So when we talk about our entering into the Paschal mystery, it's not something that we just honor and commemorate and acknowledge as events that happen in Jesus's life, but Jesus then actually offers us to become partakers in this Paschal mystery as a cycle that we cycle through over and over and over. Oftentimes we talk about in the church, we want to engage in and offer to people spiritual formation. Well, ultimately, we can go to lots of classes, we can read books and have discussions, and that's very fruitful for pointing us toward spiritual transformation and spiritual formation. However, the proof's in the pudding when it's lived out, and we live it out by ourselves cycling through the Paschal mystery over and over, where we encounter our pain and suffering, where we encounter our deaths and losses that we experience in life, where we encounter our tomb-like experience of being in the tomb, of which the COVID pandemic has been a year-long tomb-like experience that offers us the chance for quiet transformation. And then we're all kind of joined together looking for what is resurrection, when is it going to come, and what is it going to look like for us when it does come. And then how do we then take this experience and be transformed by it, such that the life that we ascend into and our ascension into new life that is a more life-giving way of being than before we entered the tomb of COVID, in a sense, that we entered into last year. And so that's the exploration that I want to do with us together today. An important point with that is that I want us to always be able to, as a final result of this talk and this experience tonight, I want us to realize that no matter what we're going through, whether it's a COVID type experience or whether it's something that's just individual to you at some point future down the road, the more that we can enter more fully into this rhythm of the Paschal mystery and realize that it's okay, it's important that we're always able to locate ourselves within that. So whenever word came down about the world shutting down, I knew that we were entering into a liminal space, and I know that from my experience with engaging with the Paschal mystery, that's potential for really amazing and powerful transformation. And that's how I've tried to approach it for myself, and that's how I've tried to approach it with the people that I work with. So before we get into actually I'm going to lead you at the end of this talk in an actual reflection that'll last about 10 minutes, where I'm going to actually take you through an examine experience where you're going to examine what was your life before COVID, what's been your experience of this time during the pandemic and during the shutdown and during the radical changes that we've had to endure in response to the pandemic, and then what are your hopes and expectations for life after. And it's so important that we do this sort of reflection, because that's how we capture the graces that have been offered to us through this experience. So that's my ultimate hope and desire for us today. So before we actually get into that reflection, I want to lay a little bit of groundwork in a couple of areas that have come up for me regularly in my own life and in the people that I work with, that I think will kind of help you and make that reflection be more fruitful for you. The first thing is that each of us individually has to recognize that this experience of COVID, even though we've all gone through it together, each of our individual experiences of it, we've experienced it individually in very, very different ways. And there's a whole spectrum of what that's looked like for people. And so this is important for us to recognize this for ourselves, to give expression to our experience of this pandemic. But it's also important to keep in mind that what our experience has been is not necessarily been what our neighbor's experience has been. And that's an important thing. So I just want to talk through that just a little bit. On one extreme, the COVID and the pandemic has been utterly devastating for some folks. I mean, top of the list there, are people who have lost loved ones to the virus. Also on that spectrum, I think about the medical workers and other frontline workers who really have put their lives at risk on a daily basis and have worked tirelessly and have not had the benefit of working from home. That this has been in some ways a very traumatic experience for people in that category. I think about the marriages and the strains on families that I've witnessed. People all of a sudden having to work in confined spaces, whether it's a family or a single parent, raising children, managing their work in this confined space, and trying to guide their kids through the schooling process, becoming the teacher in a sense, the teacher monitor during their education. That has been an enormous strain for many, many people. Obviously, there are sectors of workers. I think about the restaurant industry and entertainment industry, that those kinds of workers who have lost many jobs. And so obviously this has been their experience of COVID has been extraordinarily devastating. And then not to mention just the traditional life events like weddings, funerals, baptisms, just your ability to just go to mass that have been upended, these things that are just kind of provide structure and stability to our lives got upended. So there's a spectrum of ways that in people who have encountered the pandemic, and it's been really devastating. However, that's not everybody has fit in that devastating side. There's another side over here of people to where the pandemic has actually not been that devastating at all, and has actually brought about some good in their life, in the sense of, I think about introverts. I myself am an introvert, and everyone talks about, oh my gosh, I can't go do all these things. And it's like, it's been kind of a relief to me as an introvert. I know there's certain events that are kind of perfunctory that you're supposed to be at, and it's been a real relief to be able to say, sorry, I can't do that. It's not safe. And realize that it's kind of better for me. And as I've shared this with other introverts, whether friends, acquaintances, or even clients, it's been so interesting, the overwhelming response that introverts have really said, gosh, I didn't know I could live this way. It's almost like they've been given permission to live in a way that's more natural to themselves. And there's a way that they've really, in a sense, kind of benefited, strangely enough, from this experience. And it's interesting that people need to be able to give, whether it's been on the devastating side or it's been on the more beneficial side, it's important that people, as I lead you to reflect on what your experience has been, the whole point here is that you need to give yourself permission, and it's okay to give yourself permission to really be honest about what the experience has been for you. In addition to the introverts, I've talked to a lot of people who had always dreamt of having the flexibility of being able to work remotely, work from home. And now all of a sudden, where it was not really culturally okay within their company and such, now a lot of people, not necessarily everybody, but a lot of people have had that opportunity, and they love it in many senses. And they really are not looking forward to going back to the way it was. And so it's important for them to be able to own that this has been, in a sense, a life-giving experience for them, and to be able to be mindful as when the pandemic passes, what are the ways they might be able to maintain that sort of situation, to experience the life-givingness and the flexibility that they've had and discovered through something as horrible as the pandemic. So the whole point being, to acknowledge for yourself and for those around you and the people that you encounter, some people have had a very devastating experience during this time, and that's their experience, and it's real, and they need to be able to give voice to that. For other people, it's been relatively a minor and in many ways beneficial, strangely enough, experience for them. And guess what? They need to be able to give expression to that as well. So that's point number one. Point number two, that it comes up for me often with people that I'm working with and processing their experience with COVID, is just the difficulty it is for people to give voice in naming their emotions, identifying their emotions of what they're actually feeling, staying with those when they're uncomfortable long enough to be able to give expression of those emotions, and then to do some work around making meaning of those things such that they can choose how to proactively respond to those emotions. And so to that end, we're going to put up a slide that I use with clients to help work with this, and we'll come back to it to use it, and I'll use it as an example, just so you can see there's this thing called the feeling wheel. And this is the thing, because in our culture, we're not given language. Like, when did I ever have a class in elementary school, middle school, high school, or college to say, here are feelings, here's the language of feelings, here's how feelings work in your life, and here's the information they provide, and here's how you use them to respond in life such that you move to a much more life-giving way of being in the world. I never got that education, and most of the clients that I work with haven't either. And so it's just really important that we have tools, to know that we have tools that we can use. And I'll talk you through an example later, about how I've used that with a particular client and how it sort of was opened up a more life-giving path for this person. So, again, acknowledging that the experience of COVID is very different for everyone, and it affects us at the feeling and emotional level, and we need to give ourselves permission in order to give expression to that. So when I talk about opportunities for transformation through COVID, I just want to give you a few examples, that I've encountered. One of them is that let's take a couple. They're both experiencing COVID in their household in very similar ways. And yet, you might have one person of that couple is a highly, highly anxious person. And their response to COVID is that, I've got to clean every package. We cannot have any outside interaction. We are not allowed to order in food when we're stressed. We're both working from home, we're raising children, and yet we can't order in food. So that this is a highly anxious person, and this is the way the highly anxious person in this couple has chosen to respond. You've got the other spouse, and their anxiety level is not nearly as high. And they're like, it would be really helpful if we could order in food 1 or 2 times a week. It would be really helpful if every time we went to the grocery store, or maybe even ordered in groceries, as a lot of people are starting to do, if we didn't spend an hour plus wiping every product down. Now, when I'm encountered with clients like this, I'm not the COVID expert, and I can't tell anyone what the right level of care and concern and precautions are. That's not my job, and I don't have that information. I know I've had to make those decisions for myself and kind of take in the information of other people's experience around me, and to kind of feel my way through that of what's right for my wife and myself. However, this couple that I'm giving as an example of, where one is really highly anxious, this person is blaming everything on COVID. Well, it's COVID. The strains in our marriage, it's about COVID. If COVID was gone, we wouldn't be going through this marital strains that we're encountering. And what I have to work with the highly anxious person about is that COVID is really shining a spotlight on their issue with anxiety. And it's okay to feel anxiety with COVID. I'm not coming here saying that no one should feel anxiety about COVID. We've all felt. It would be unnatural to not feel some sense of anxiety as a result of our experience with COVID. However, how life depleting do we allow that anxiety to be in our life? And that's the big challenge for a number of people, is that COVID has shined a highlight on an outsized place that anxiety is playing in their lives, and actually, quite frankly, did before COVID. It's just that COVID's shining a spotlight on it. And so the issue isn't for COVID to go away and then their problems are solved. Their opportunity for transformation, the grace that's being given to them through this COVID experience, is to realize, wow, anxiety plays a really outsized place in my life and in my responses. And it's very life depleting for me. And what I'm trying to help them to see is how that's life depleting for them. Now, I do have a particular person in mind when I'm sharing this. This person is not affiliated with Assumption. And this person is not a person of faith. And I often find myself wanting this person, I wish this person could be invited in to partake in the Paschal mystery. What I long for this person is for him to have some sort of experience and relationship with Christ, that he could hear the words of Christ echo in him, that Christ echoed very often, according to the writings in the New Testament. Fear not, for I am with you. It's one of the most oft-repeated phrases that Jesus uttered, as recorded by the New Testament. Fear not. And it wasn't a chastising fear not. It was a gentle invitation to say, there's a way of life. I am modeling a way of life for you through my experience of the Paschal mystery, the pain and suffering, the death that I will endure, the liminal space of the tomb, my resurrection, my ascension into new life. You can too enter into this way of life and cycle through your life in such a way that when you encounter these hardships, they don't have to tear your life apart. They can actually be transformative, such that when you ascend into new life, as Christ did, you're ascending in a life a changed person. And you're going out of your post-COVID life and living it in a much more life-giving way than you lived before. And that's our hope. That's our desire. So that's one issue I've come across with, is just really paying attention to what is your level of anxiety. Is there a sense in which that is protecting you, or is it actually harming you and those around you? And so that's one example that I wanted to offer. Another one is there's sadness, right? Because when we look at the Paschal mystery, part of that is pain and suffering leads us to a death, and death equated to losses in our lives. It doesn't have to be the physical death of someone, but just the death of one example for myself of a loss that I didn't know I was experiencing. Because I'm an introvert, I don't go to a lot of parties. I don't I don't get my energy from things like that. But where I did get my energy, I loved getting together for one-on-one meetings like at breakfast, one-on-one conversations like at lunch, or grabbing coffee or a beer with someone at some time. And for so long, that has been shut out. And I didn't realize how life-giving those experiences were to me at the time. I didn't think about those things. I just thought, that's just something that you do. And I didn't realize the role that they played in my life until it was no more. And so therefore, this experience has made me like, I felt sad and I felt something was missing. And I realized, it was those simple acts of going and getting coffee with a friend, going and getting beer with a person, or having a meal and sharing breakfast and having a conversation. I had no idea what that was like. What that was like and what those things did for me. And those were my losses that I accounted. And so I want to put up this feelings wheel tool that I've used before. And in it, if you'll join with me, I'll lead you through an example that happened with me with a client. Again, this client is not affiliated with Assumption. But basically, this client came into me, and his words were, I'm in a rough headspace, a fog. I just want to sleep. When I hear I just want to sleep, that as a therapist, that points me to probably experiencing some sort of, certainly sadness, probably depression. But this was a person who, like many of us, has not really grasped the language of feelings and emotions such that they can tell their story, that they can tell sense what's going on the inside, sit with it, name it for themselves, and then express it to another person. Sounds so simple, right? But it's a really difficult thing for many of us. And so when he shared with me that I'm in a rough headspace, a fog, I just want to sleep, I've provided him, we use this feelings wheel as a tool to help us communicate about the deeper things in his life. And so when he looked at it, he was like, well, I said, well, so, this feels like depression to me. So he located himself, if you'll notice the blue part there at the bottom of the feeling, at the very inner circle, blue, the inner core emotion there is sadness. But what he said triggered me to depression. So we pointed out the depressed part there on the wheel. And I said, so, it sounds to me like you're encountering some depression. Is there a sense of, if you go to the outer then part, it's inferior and empty. And I said, is there a sense of where you're experiencing a sense of feeling inferior or emptiness? And he said, no, And I said, well, look along that outer rim of words there that is in that same section, and what is something that? Is there something there that catches your attention that you identify with? And he looked at it and he said, yeah, isolated. And I said, well, tell me about that. And he said, well, things are getting more difficult between me and my wife. And I thought, oh, well, are there marital problems here? And so I explored that a little bit. And he said, no, I love her dearly. And I know she loves me. So it wasn't a sense of there was a brokenness of their commitment or that their love was waning. They very much loved one another. What he said was, I'm feeling isolated. And so I had him tell me about that. And so his isolation stemmed from the standpoint that through COVID and their work situations are such that in the past they used to get to spend whole evenings together. But that the way that that COVID has affected their whole work life and work structure is such that they only get to spend maybe 1 hour a day of just kind of ships passing each other basically each day. And that's what was making him feel isolated. And so as we moved back on the wheel from isolated there in the outer rim, that was put him in touch with the fact that he could tell me that he was actually feeling a sense of loneliness. And that was really what was at the root of his sadness, which was expressed to me through, I'm in a rough headspace. I'm in a fog. I just want to sleep. And so we didn't focus on a sense of, oh, he's experiencing depression, so we've got to address this depression. No, it was a sense of he's feeling isolated from someone that he otherwise feels really connected to. And so how can we find ways? Like, we can't make their work situation change with COVID right now. And yet, what can we do? How can this be a transformative experience for him such that, one, he's learning about his emotions and getting in touch with them, and he's learning how to express them. But that also, in this particular situation, what's being called for? What is the response now that he's in touch with those emotions? What responses are at his disposable, or not disposable? What are the responses that are at his disposal that he can give his attention to somehow make this more life-giving for him? And what we came up with was the fact that, what he could do was he could surprise her by going out and buying one of those white boards or grease boards, a small one that can be stuck to the refrigerator. And he can connect with her by leaving her a surprise message. And then, in a sense, inviting her to, when she comes by, erase that and leave him a message. It doesn't completely solve the problem, doesn't make it completely all better, but it addresses the specific need that he got in touch with of, I need to feel some sort of connection. What can I do to experience that? And so that's now doing its job to, at least the best that it can, provide a greater sense of connection between the two of them when COVID's still here. It's not gone away, but now it's forcing them to experiment with some new behaviors to get their needs met. And so I give one final example of is this business of experimenting with new behaviors. I get to work with a lot of, here being in the River North area, I get to work with a lot of young adults. And so, what are you spending a lot of your time doing as a young adult? Well, it's finding a mate. And so the dating scene has been totally disrupted by COVID. And so earlier on, I was working with this young adult, again, not a person who goes to Assumption, but this young adult, his MO, and a problem that he struggled with was he basically met people at bars. They would get into a sexual relationship very early in the relationship, and then the relationship would flame out, and he'd be like, oh my God, what happened? And he was very fast in his relationships. And so even before COVID had started, we talked about what are some ways that we can approach his approach to initiating relationships, of basically slowing the process down, taking time to get to know someone through conversation first before things advanced. And that was really hard for him. Well, again, COVID hits, and what I told him I said, look, this is the perfect opportunity for you. Everyone's in the same exact situation as you are. This was when things were really, really shut down. And I said, I'm neutral toward online dating. I don't push it, but I'm not against it. If that's what works for a person, great. But I said, here's a chance for you to very safely and slowly get to know someone through corresponding. Their profiles match, and they can start corresponding through the applications. And so that way you're just talking, and spend some time talking to different people. Get an experience of what that's like to just initiate relationship and slow things down and take it slower. And so that's been a transformative experience where he's learned he was forced to, but realized that, hey, I don't have to rush into relationships. I don't have to pick up people at bars and immediately get in a sack with them. And that was not producing a life-giving, fruitful experience in his life, and he was getting in touch with that. And so this was a situation where COVID's been transformative for him, that it's forced him to experiment with new behaviors. And so that is just 3 examples of how things have been very, very, very transformative for different people. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lead us through about a 10-minute reflection experience, where I'm going to ask you to look for, and I'll lead you through the questions, and I'll leave about 2 minutes between each session. So you really just have to close your eyes and just reflect on the little piece that I do, the question that I ask you at each time. But just to give you an overview, I'm going to lead you to reflect on life pre-COVID and see, what was that like? What have the losses been? What have been the gains for you? Then we're going to direct our attention to this time of the liminal space when we shut down and things we're not quite out of the tomb fully yet, and to reflect on what's been going on with you. What needs are you getting in touch with for your own life? What are some things that you've lost that it's actually good that you've lost? What are some things that you've lost that you need to grieve? How have you been transformed during this time? And to the extent that you haven't been transformed yet, it's not over. How might you be transformed in the time before the pandemic is in the rearview mirror? And then I want to direct your attention toward the hopes and sort of dreams and desires that you have for what will life be like after COVID. So I would just ask that you get in a comfortable position, I'm going to put up a pretty image that I find brings me a lot of peace. You can look at that as you listen to me, or you can just simply close your eyes. I encourage you to grab maybe a pad and pencil so that what the fruit of your reflection, that you capture those. And then in about 10 minutes, we'll have an opportunity to join up together and basically share and hear from one another about our respective experiences, and hopefully all find ways to a more life-giving place for us as we, quote, ascend into the new life post-COVID. So go ahead and get comfortable. Uh, so I'll start off with the first question for you to reflect upon. Think about your life pre-COVID, before the shutdown. What were the things that were really, really life-giving to you? And what were the things that were more life-depleting for you? And take a couple of minutes to just get in touch with those things. Next, I ask that you direct your attention to this past year, this in the tomb of sorts. During this time of kind of things being shut down, what's brought you life and what has depleted your life while you've been in the tomb? Now, turn your attention to that part of yourself that's anticipating life outside of the tomb of COVID. What life-giving desires and needs do you hope to have fulfilled? And what are your fears and concerns? Now, I want to invite you to just take some time in prayer to express both your needs and desires and your fears and concerns to Christ. Knowing that He's inviting you into His Paschal mystery, that this can be a transformative experience for you. Finally, if you take all of that in as you thought about life pre-COVID, now during COVID, your thoughts about what life's going to be like afterwards, as you reflect on all of that, what are the ways that you have been and would like to be transformed by your experience of this liminal space of the past year? Well, thank you so much for participating today. Um, we will now get together and have a chance to share our reflections with one another.